She bought a man for $1. $1 to keep the winter from stealing the breath of her children. But the man who answered the strange summons wasn't just a stranger looking for shelter. He was a ghost. A ghost from a night she had tried to burn from her memory, a night of blood and ash, and a prayer whispered into the darkness. And he wasn't there just to save her. He was there to collect on a promise made long ago, a promise sealed in violence and shadowed by a secret that could get them all killed. This is the story of what came next. The town wasn't much more than a rumor. A few tired buildings slumped against a gray sky, a church whose bell had long been silenced, and a saloon that smelled of stale beer and regret. For a woman alone, it was a place you passed through, not a place you stopped. Especially not a woman like Marbeth Greeley. She was pregnant, her belly a tight drum beneath a threadbare shawl. 2 children, a pair of small, silent shadows, clung to her sides. Joanna, who was 8 going on 40, held her little brother's hand in a grip that defied the bone-deep cold. Matthew was 5, and he hadn't spoken a word since he watched his father die. They had walked out of Kansas with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the echoing words of a preacher who called a grieving widow improper. Improper. As if grief were a dress you could simply change. But this town, this last stop before the mountains swallowed the world, had something no other place did. A man for sale. The notice was nailed to a post, stark and strange. Man of the mountain seeks lawful employment, service for shelter through the winter, $1, no questions asked. The townsfolk laughed, called him a coward or a fool. Marbeth saw an answer, a shield against the wind, a guard against the night, a presence to fill the terrifying silence. The deal was made without a word wasted. She unfolded the last dollar she owned, a single worn bill, and handed it to a man who looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself. His shoulders were broad, his beard was a black tangle, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm, unreadable and deep. He just looked at her, then at the children, and gave one sharp nod. He had a wagon waiting, as if he knew she'd come. As they left the town fading behind them, the silence in the wagon wasn't empty. It was heavy, weighted with things unsaid. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his past. She only knew he was her last desperate hope. The cabin was nestled deep in a valley, larger than she'd expected, with smoke already whispering from its stone chimney. He had been preparing, waiting. He helped her down from the wagon, his movements sure and careful, never quite touching her. Inside, a fire was already crackling. The air smelled of stew. It was sparse, but it was warm. It was safe. The children, exhausted by the road, collapsed onto a pallet of quilts and were asleep in minutes. Marbeth sank onto a stool by the fire, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the weight of it a constant, aching reminder of all she had to protect. He spoke from the shadows, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You're too thin for a woman so far along." She didn't flinch, just nodded. "Been a long road." "You got a plan for the birth?" Her voice was a dry whisper. "No." He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the hiss and pop of the fire. "Midwife's a week's ride south of here. You won't make it. Not if the snows come early." She finally met his gaze across the flickering light. For the first time, she saw something move in his eyes. Not pity, not kindness. It was recognition. And a cold dread, sharp and sudden, pricked at her skin. How could this stranger recognize her? She'd never set foot in these mountains before in her life. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind howl and the steady, quiet breathing of the man in the other room. The man with no name. She clutched her belly, a terrible feeling twisting in her gut. This wasn't just about survival anymore. She had stumbled into something else, something she didn't understand. She had paid $1 for protection, but she was starting to wonder if she'd just bought herself a cage. She woke to a strange sound. It wasn't the wind, or the fire, or the breathing of her children. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping. Marbeth rose from her cot, every muscle aching, and crept toward the main room. The man was sitting at the table, his back to her. The fire cast his long shadow against the log wall. In his hands, he held the single dollar she had given him. He wasn't counting it. He was rubbing it, slowly, obsessively against the rough wood of the table, as if trying to wear it down to nothing. He was whispering, his voice too low to make out the words, a strange, guttural chant. She froze, her blood turning to ice. What kind of man behaved this way? Who was he? He must have felt her eyes on him, because he stopped. The whispering ceased. He slowly turned his head, his face half hidden in the shadows. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. She found her voice, though it trembled. "What are you doing?" He looked down at the dollar bill in his hand, then back at her. "Remembering," he said, and the single word hung in the air like a death sentence. He didn't say another word about it. The next morning, he was outside at dawn, the crisp air ringing with the clean crack of his axe splitting wood. Marbeth watched him from the porch, wrapped in her shawl, the unnerving image of him with the dollar bill burned into her mind. He moved with a brutal efficiency, each swing perfect, powerful. He was a man who knew how to work. But there was something else there, too, a coiled tension, a readiness that had nothing to do with chopping firewood. When he finally paused to wipe his brow, he didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the tree line. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice flat. She hesitated, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. But what choice did she have? "Marbeth," she said. He kept his back to her. "Marbeth what?" "Greeley," she said. "Marbeth Greeley." The axe fell from his hand. It landed in the snow with a soft thud, but the silence that followed was deafening. He stood frozen for a long second, his shoulders rigid. Then slowly, he turned. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were burning. They weren't the eyes of a stranger anymore. They were the eyes of a man staring at a ghost. "Marbeth Greeley," he repeated, and the name sounded like a curse on his lips. The air left her lungs. How do you know that name?" He took a step toward the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. He didn't say, "You prayed my name." He didn't say, "I've heard of you." He said something that shattered her world. "Your husband," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Jacob, he told me." Marbeth staggered back, her hand flying to her throat. Jacob, her dead husband. This man was speaking his name like they'd just shared a drink yesterday. It was impossible. It was insane. "You're lying," she whispered, her mind reeling. "My husband is dead. He's dead." The man took another step, his eyes never leaving hers. The storm in them was swirling, dark and dangerous. He looked down at the axe lying in the snow, then back at her. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I know he's dead, Marbeth." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the horror build in her chest until she could barely breathe. "He told me your name right before I killed him." The world tilted. The trees, the snow, the gray sky, it all spun into a dizzying vortex of white and black. Killed him? This man, this stranger she had brought into her home, this protector she had paid with her last dollar. He was her husband's murderer? Her legs gave way, and she crumpled against the cabin wall, a strangled sob escaping her lips. The children. Oh God, the children. She had led the wolf right to her own door. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching her break, his face unreadable. "It wasn't like that," he said finally, his voice rough. "You just said..." She choked. "You said you killed him." "There was a fight," he said, his gaze distant now, lost in a memory she couldn't see. "A range war. Land and water, the usual story. Your Jacob was on one side, I was on the other." She stared at him, trying to make sense of it. Jacob had told her he'd died on the wrong end of a banker's rifle, a dispute over a loan. It had all been a lie. "He was shot," the man continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "It was a bad wound. He knew he wasn't going to make it. He was lying there in the dust, and he made me a promise." "A promise?" she whispered. He knew who was really after him. It wasn't about the range war. That was just a cover. It was his own family, a brother he never told you about, a man named Empt Case. M.T. Case. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it sent a new wave of terror through her. Jacob knew Empt wouldn't stop. He knew he'd come for you and the children, so he made me swear it. Swear I'd find you. Swear I'd protect you. The man's eyes locked back onto hers, intense and piercing. He gave me your name, Marbeth, and he told me where you'd likely run, to these mountains. She was shaking her head, trying to deny it, trying to push the horrifying truth away. Her entire life, the story of her husband's death, was a carefully constructed lie, and the man who held the real story was standing right in front of her. So the notice, she stammered. The $1. It was for you, he said. I put it up hoping you'd be the one to answer. I didn't know for sure, not until you said your name. He had been waiting for her, hunting for her, all this time. But the relief she should have felt was choked by a deeper, more terrifying question. Why? She asked, her voice barely audible. Why is his own brother hunting me? The man looked away, toward the dark line of pines on the ridge. His jaw was clenched so tight, she could see the muscles straining. It's not just about you, Marbeth, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It's about what Jacob stole from him before he ran. He paused, and the silence that followed was more frightening than anything he had said so far. It wasn't money, he said, turning back to face her. It was a secret buried right here, in this cabin. Before she could process the new shockwave, his head snapped up, his eyes narrowed, fixed on the distant ridge. Get inside, he hissed. Now! She followed his gaze. There, silhouetted against the pale morning sky, was a figure on horseback, watching them. Just watching. And Marbeth knew, with a certainty that froze her to the core, that their fragile peace had just been shattered. The ghost from Jacob's past had found them. The rider on the ridge didn't move. He was a statue of menace, a dark promise against the snow. Marbeth scrambled inside, pulling the children close, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man followed, bolting the heavy wooden door behind him. The sound echoed in the small cabin like a coffin being nailed shut. Who is that? She breathed, her voice tight with fear. I don't know, he said, moving to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. Not Empt, not his style. MTT doesn't watch, he attacks. He turned from the window, his face grim. But it means they know we're here. They've found us. The children were silent, their eyes wide with a fear they didn't understand, but could feel in the very air they breathed. Joanna's hand found the fabric of Marbeth's skirt. Matthew just stared, his face a small, pale mask. You said Jacob stole something, Marbeth said, forcing the words out. A secret. Here? In this cabin? The man nodded, his eyes scanning the room, the hearth, the floorboards. This wasn't just some random place he sent me, Marbeth. This cabin belonged to your family. Generations ago. Before the Case family stole the land, the deeds, everything. They ran your ancestors out, left them with nothing. Her family? She knew nothing of this. Her parents were orphans, their history a blank page. Jacob found the proof, he went on, his voice low and urgent. The original deed, hidden away in his family's safe. That's what he stole. That's why he ran. He was coming here to claim what was rightfully yours. The world was spinning again. This cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was her birthright, a legacy she never knew she had, and the man hunting her wanted to steal it back. The man crossed the room and knelt by the hearth, running his hands over the cold stones. He told me he left it here, hidden. He never said where. Suddenly, the horseman on the ridge spurred his horse and disappeared back over the rise. The immediate threat was gone, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. We have to find it, the man said, standing up, before MT gets here. I still don't even know your name, she said, the absurdity of it hitting her. He looked at her, and for a moment, the hard lines of his face softened. Clay, he said. My name is Clay Maddox. Clay Maddox. The name hit her like a physical blow. She'd heard that name before. Whispered in saloons, printed on wanted posters. Clay Maddox, the outlaw, the gunslinger. Some said he'd robbed a train. Others swore he'd saved a town from a fire. A man of myth and violence. and he was in her cabin, protecting her children. The layers of the story were becoming too much to bear. She was the descendant of landowners. Her husband was a thief who died for a noble cause, and her guardian was a wanted man. It was a fever dream. "Joanna," Marbeth said, her voice shaking. "Matthew, help me look. We're looking for anything that doesn't belong. A loose board, a hollow stone." They searched. A frantic, desperate hunt against a clock they couldn't see. Clay checked the walls, the loft, the chimney. Marbeth and the children scoured the floor. Nothing. Hours passed. The sun began to dip, painting the snow outside in shades of orange and purple. Despair began to creep in. Then Joanna's small voice piped up from the corner. "Mama?" She was holding something in her hand, something small and dark. It was an old, tarnished silver locket shaped like a heart. "I found it under the floorboard where the wood is loose," she said. Marbeth took the locket from her daughter. It was heavy, cold. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled with the clasp. It clicked open. She braced herself for a picture, a tiny portrait of an ancestor she'd never known. But there was no picture. Instead, nestled in the worn velvet lining, was a small, ornate iron key, a key. A current of adrenaline shot through her. They hadn't been looking for a box. They'd been looking for a lock. Clay was at her side in an instant. He took the key, his eyes blazing with a new intensity. "Where?" he breathed. Their eyes met, and they both had the same thought at the same time. The hearth. The one place built of stone, the one place strong enough to hide a secret for generations. They flew to the fireplace, running their hands over the stones again, this time with purpose. Marbeth felt it first. A single stone, slightly recessed, with a texture different from the others. She pushed. It didn't move. Clay put his shoulder to it. He grunted, strained, and with a low groan of grinding rock, the stone shifted inward, revealing a dark, hollow cavity behind it. Inside, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, was a small, iron strongbox. Clay reached in and pulled it out. It was heavy, ancient, and on the front, caked in rust but still visible, was a keyhole that matched the key in his hand. His hands were shaking as he inserted the key. It turned with a rusted shriek that echoed in the silent cabin. He lifted the lid. Inside, lying on a bed of yellowed paper, was a folded document tied with a faded ribbon. The deed, Jacob's proof, Marbeth's legacy. But there was something else underneath it. A letter. The handwriting was Jacob's. Her breath caught in her throat. Clay lifted it out and handed it to her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the brittle paper. "My dearest Marbeth," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and Clay Maddox has kept his word. For that, I am grateful. There is so much I never told you, so much I was ashamed of. The deed will give you back your land, your future, but it will not keep you safe. Not from my brother." Marbeth's eyes scanned the page, her heart pounding. "The reason I truly left my home, the reason I stole this deed was not just about land. It was about you. It happened 10 years ago, at a burned-out chapel outside Ellensburg. You were 17. You were attacked by a drifter. The air vanished from her lungs. The memory, buried so deep she thought it had turned to dust, came rushing back. The pain, the fire, the blood. The desperate prayer she'd whispered for someone, anyone, to save her. She had told Jacob about that night. He had held her and comforted her. The letter continued, each word a new nail in the coffin of the life she thought she knew. "He was not a drifter, Marbeth. It was my brother. It was Empt." A raw, guttural sound escaped her lips. The monster from her worst nightmare, the faceless shadow that had haunted her for a decade, had a name, and it was her husband's brother. "I found out what he did. I confronted him. I left my family to protect you from him, but I lived every day in fear that he would find us. He is a sickness, Marbeth, a poison." Her eyes flew to the last line of the letter, and the words seemed to burn themselves into her soul. "He will not stop. He doesn't just want the land. He wants to finish what he started that night. He believes you, and everything that comes from you belongs to him." A loud crack echoed from outside, not a branch breaking, a gunshot. It splintered the wood of the door, showering the floor with debris. Marbeth looked up from the letter, her eyes wide with terror, and met Clay's grim gaze. He was already moving, grabbing the rifle from above the mantelpiece. "They're here," he said, and through the shattered hole in the door, she could see them. 3 riders, cresting the hill, their forms dark and terrible against the dying sun. And the man in the lead, even from a distance, she recognized him. The swagger, the shape of him. It was the face from her nightmares. It was Case. The cabin, once a symbol of hope, had become a tomb. MT and his 2 men didn't charge. They circled, slow and predatory, like buzzards waiting for the thing inside to die. The setting sun glinted off the long rifle slung across Mt's back, a sliver of deadly light. "Get the children," Clay commanded, his voice a low growl. "Under the floorboards, there's a crawl space by the back wall." Marbeth moved on instinct, her mind a numb fog of terror. She pulled Joanna and Matthew, their small bodies trembling, and guided them to the loose boards Clay had pointed out. Joanna clutched a small rag doll, her knuckles white. Matthew was still silent, his eyes vast and dark. "Stay here," Marbeth whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't make a sound until I or Clay come for you. Do you understand?" Joanna nodded, tears streaming down her face. Marbeth kissed their foreheads, a desperate, frantic gesture, before covering them with the boards and an old rug. She rose, her body feeling strangely light, disconnected. Clay handed her an old, heavy shotgun. "You know how to use this?" he asked, not looking at her. "My father taught me," she said, the weight of it familiar in her hands. A voice called from outside, slick with arrogance. "Marbeth, I know you're in there, darlin', and I know you've got company." It was him. MT. The sound of his voice was like gravel scraping against her soul. "Come on out now," he drawled. "No need for this to get ugly. I'm just here to collect on a family debt." Clay stood by the window, motionless as a statue. "He's trying to draw us out." "That baby you're carrying, Marbeth," Mt's voice dripped with poison. "It's got Case blood in it one way or another. I'm just here to welcome it to the family." A raw fury, hot and sharp, pierced through Marbeth's fear. This man, this monster, was laying claim to her unborn child. The shotgun felt heavier in her hands, steadier. "Don't answer him," Clay said. But Mt wasn't done. His next words were aimed at Clay. "And you, the ghost. I heard Jacob hired himself a protector before he died. Clay Maddox. I've wanted to meet the man who cost me a fortune for a long, long time." Clay's jaw clenched. "What does he mean?" Marbeth asked. "I wasn't just a gunslinger," Clay admitted, his voice tight. "I was hired by a land commission to investigate the cases, to get proof of their thefts. Your husband was my witness. His death. It ruined my case and put a price on my head." Another layer, another lie peeled back. He wasn't just an outlaw. He was an agent of the law, undercover, who had been betrayed and left for dead. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more horrific than she could have ever imagined. A sudden knock rattled the door. Not loud, just 3 polite taps, a mockery of civility. Clay raised his rifle. Marbeth aimed the shotgun at the door. The silence stretched. Then Mt's voice came again, closer this time, right outside the door. "Tell you what," he said, his tone conversational, friendly. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever heard. "You send out the woman and I'll let you walk away, Maddox. A man like you can disappear. Start over. This ain't your fight." "It is now," Clay growled back. A low chuckle from outside. Wrong answer. The world exploded. The front window shattered inward, spraying glass and splinters across the room. Clay returned fire without hesitation, a clean, sharp report that sent one of the men scrambling for cover behind a snow-covered woodpile. Another shot slammed into the wall near Marbeth's head, the impact jarring her to her bones. They were trapped, pinned down. Suddenly, a strange lull fell over the fight. The shooting stopped. The silence was unnerving. "What are they doing?" Marbeth whispered. Clay was peering through a crack in the wall. They're just waiting." Then a new sound, the faint, frightened whimper of a child. It was coming from under the floorboards. Marbeth's blood ran cold. She crawled to the rug and pulled it back. "Matthew? Joanna?" A small sob answered her. "Mama!" Joanna cried. "Matthew's scared!" In that moment of distraction, Marbeth's eyes fell on her son. Matthew was curled in a tight ball, his face buried in his sister's dress. He was shaking violently. And in that moment, a horrible, sickening thought clicked into place. Matthew had been there when Jacob died. He had stopped speaking that very day. She had always assumed it was the trauma of seeing the violence. But what if it was more? What if he saw who did it? "Matthew," she said, her voice low and urgent, trying to keep the desperation out of it. "Sweetheart, listen to Mama. The men outside, the bad men who hurt Papa, was Mr. Case. Was that man? Was he there?" Matthew lifted his head. His eyes were huge, swimming with a terror that was old, too old for a 5-year-old boy. He stared at his mother, his lips trembling. And then, for the first time in 3 months, he spoke. His voice was a tiny, raspy thing, barely a whisper. "Yes." Tears of relief and horror pricked Marbeth's eyes. He could speak. He had seen him. But then he said something else. Something that made no sense. Something that ripped the ground out from under her feet once more. "Papa wasn't fighting," Matthew whispered, his eyes locked on his mother's. "Papa was talking to him. He was smiling." Marbeth stared at her son, her mind refusing to compute the words. Smiling? Jacob was smiling at his own killer? "What? What else, Matthew?" She pushed, her heart hammering. Matthew took a shaky breath. Papa gave him the map. The world stopped. Everything she thought she knew, every sacrifice, every heroic act crumbled into dust. Jacob hadn't been protecting her. He hadn't been buying her time. He had betrayed her. He had led his brother, his own personal monster, right to her doorstep. He had handed Empt the map to her inheritance, to her home. The entire thing, the promise to Clay, the secret deed, the letter, it was all an elaborate lie, a trap, and she had walked right into the center of it. Marbeth felt a cold, hollowing despair wash over her, so profound it threatened to drown her. She looked at Clay, who had overheard Matthew's words. His face was a thundercloud of confusion and disbelief. "It doesn't make sense," Clay muttered, shaking his head. "Why would he do all this? Why send me to you if he was just going to hand you over?" The letter. Jacob's letter. It had felt so real, so full of anguish and regret. Had it all been a performance? A final, cruel trick played on the woman he supposedly loved? Suddenly a smell wafted through the shattered window. Acrid, sharp, smoke. Clay's head snapped up. "They're trying to burn us out!" Panic, raw and primal, seized Marbeth. Fire, just like the night at the chapel. History was repeating itself, a vicious, closing circle. "The deed!" she cried, scrambling back to the strongbox. She grabbed the document and the fake map that Jacob had planted. Wait, the map. Papa gave him the map. Clay's eyes widened as the same thought struck him. "Matthew," he said, his voice sharp, "what did the map look like? Was it old paper, tied with a ribbon?" Matthew shook his head. "No, it was new, drawn on back of poster, a wanted poster." Clay lunged for the strongbox and pulled out the real deed and the elegant, official-looking map that was with it. He held it up. "This isn't it." Then he snatched Jacob's letter from Marbeth's hand, his eyes flying across the page, searching, hunting for a clue, for something they had missed. "My God," he breathed. "My God, Marbeth, we were wrong, all of it. We were wrong." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising with hysteria as the smell of smoke grew stronger. "He wasn't betraying you," Clay said, his face alight with a sudden, terrible understanding. "He was setting a trap." He stabbed a finger at the letter. "Listen, he will not stop. He doesn't just want the land. He wants to finish what he started." Jacob knew Empt's obsession. He knew Empt would be blinded by it. He knew he wouldn't be thinking straight. "The map," Marbeth whispered, the pieces clicking into place with dizzying speed. "It was a fake," Clay finished, a look of awe on his face. Jacob knew he was dying. He knew Empt would get to him, so he gave him what he wanted, a fake map, a map leading him somewhere else, a wild goose chase. He probably told him the real deed was buried there. He sacrificed himself, Marbeth. He put on a show for his son, smiling, talking, to make Empt believe the lie. He looked at her, his eyes full of a grim respect for the dead man. He wasn't betraying you. He was buying you time. He was leading Empt into a trap, and he was sending me, his enemy, to you with the real truth. He trusted me more than his own blood. It was a beautiful, tragic, heroic act, a final desperate move from a man who had made a lifetime of mistakes but tried to atone for them at the end. But the beautiful tragedy was cut short by a roar from outside. A piece of the roof, now engulfed in flames, crashed to the ground. The trap had failed. Empt hadn't fallen for it. Or maybe he had, and he'd come back, more furious than ever. It didn't matter. The cabin was turning into a funeral pyre. Time was up. "There's a root cellar!" Clay yelled over the roar of the fire. "The door is behind the stove. It might lead out to the creek bed. Take the children. Go!" "No!" Marbeth screamed back, the heat scorching her face. "I'm not leaving you! This is my fight!" he roared. "I'm the one he really wants. He wants me!" she cried, her voice raw. "He has always wanted me. I'm not running from him again. Not ever again." Clay stared at her for a split second, his face caught between the flickering firelight and the encroaching shadows. In his eyes, she saw 1,000 emotions: fear, admiration, regret. Then he gave a sharp nod. "Then we finish this," he said. "Together." He kicked open the back door, which was not yet on fire. "Draw them around," he yelled. "I'll take them from the front." It was a desperate, insane plan, but it was the only one they had. Marbeth took a deep breath, the smoke stinging her lungs, and plunged out into the freezing night, the shotgun clutched in her hands. The cold air was a shock after the intense heat. The night was lit by the hellish orange glow of her burning home. She could see one of Empt's men by the side of the cabin, fanning the flames. She raised the shotgun. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. "Hey!" she screamed, her voice ripping through the night. The man spun around, his face a mask of surprise. He never had time to raise his pistol. Marbeth pulled the trigger. The shotgun bucked against her shoulder, and the man crumpled into the snow with a cry of pain. One down. The shot drew the attention of the other two. MTT and his remaining man whirled toward the sound, toward her. It was exactly what Clay needed. As they turned their backs to the front of the cabin, Clay burst out of the main door like an avenging angel, his rifle barking. The second henchman went down, clutching his chest, before he even knew what hit him. Now it was just Empt. He stood frozen for a second between the burning cabin and the two women he'd been hunting, his plan in ruins, his men down. His face twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. He let out a roar and charged, not at Clay, but at Marbeth. He was a bull, a force of nature, his eyes locked on her, promising a world of pain. She tried to reload the shotgun, but her fingers were clumsy, cold. She wasn't going to make it. Suddenly Clay was there. He met Empt's charge with a flying tackle, and the two men went down in a brutal rolling heap of fists and fury. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a brawl. Two men, fueled by years of hatred and bad blood, trying to tear each other apart with their bare hands. They rolled in the snow, grunting, cursing, their blows landing with sickening, wet thuds. Marbeth finally managed to reload. She raised the shotgun, trying to get a clear shot, but they were moving too fast, a whirlwind of violence. Clay was strong, but Empt was a wild animal, crazed with rage. He got the upper hand, pinning Clay to the ground, his hands closing around Clay's throat. Clay's face began to turn purple, his legs kicking feebly. This was it. MTT was going to kill him. "No," Marbeth whispered. She stepped forward, the snow crunching under her boots, until she was standing right over them. She leveled the double barrel of the shotgun directly at Empt Case's face. "Get off him," she said. Her voice was quiet, calm, but it cut through the night like a razor. MT froze, his hands still tight on Clay's throat. He slowly looked up at her. His eyes were wide, crazed. He saw the shotgun. He saw her face. And for the first time, he saw not a victim, not a prize to be won. He saw the woman who had just shot his man. He saw the end of his story. A strange, broken smile twisted his lips. You were always stronger than him, he wheezed, looking from her to the man he was strangling. Stronger than all of us. Then Clay, finding a last reserve of strength, bucked his hips and threw Empt off him. He scrambled to his feet, gasping for air. Empt reached for the pistol at his hip, but Marbeth was faster. She didn't shoot him. She swung the heavy shotgun like a club, bringing the solid wood stock down on the side of Empt's head with all her strength. There was a sickening crack, and Empt case collapsed into the snow, silent and still. The fight was over. Silence fell, broken only by the roar of the fire and Clay's ragged gasps for breath. Marbeth stood over the man who had haunted her for a decade, the shotgun hanging limp in her hand. The firelight danced on the snow, painting everything in blood-red hues. She had done it. She had faced the monster, and she had won. As the dawn broke, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gray and pink, they saw them. A line of riders coming over the ridge, not with menace but with purpose. It was the lone horseman from before, and he had brought the law. The sheriff, a grim-faced man with tired eyes, listened to their story. He looked at the bodies, at the bound and groaning form of Empt Case, at the smoldering ruins of the cabin, and at the deed Marbeth clutched in her hand. Clay had contacted him weeks ago. The rider on the ridge hadn't been a threat. He'd been an ally, watching, waiting for the right moment. Justice, it turned out, hadn't forgotten them after all. They took Empt and his wounded man away. The law confirmed the deed was legal. The land, the smoldering patch of earth and the valley beyond it, was hers. The name Clay Maddox, the outlaw, was cleared, replaced by the story of the agent who had finally closed his case. The winter that followed was the hardest she had ever known. They lived in the small, cramped root cellar, the only part of the cabin that had survived the fire. But for the first time, Marbeth didn't feel the cold. They had nothing. And yet, they had everything. The silence in Matthew returned for a time, but it was different now. It was a healing silence. Joanna became her mother's right hand, a small, fierce woman in the making. And Clay, he stayed, he hunted, he chopped wood, he started to rebuild the cabin, log by painful log. He never spoke of the future, never made promises. He just showed her, every day, with his hands and his presence, that he wasn't going anywhere. One bitter morning, when the wind howled and the world seemed made of ice, the baby came. There was no midwife, no doctor, just Clay's steady hands and his quiet, reassuring voice guiding her through the storm of pain. And when it was over, he placed a small, squalling, perfect baby girl into her arms. "She's got your fire," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They named her Clara. It meant clear, bright, a promise of the future. As the first signs of spring began to thaw the frozen earth, they stood outside the half-rebuilt cabin, watching the sunset. Clara was bundled in Marbeth's arms. Joanna and Matthew were chasing each other, their laughter echoing in the valley. "I've been running my whole life," Clay said quietly, not looking at her. "I forgot what it felt like to stop, to have a place to stand." Marbeth rested her head against his shoulder. "This is your place now," she said, "if you want it." He finally turned to her then, and in his eyes, she saw not the ghost of an outlaw or the shadow of a killer, but the man he was always meant to be, a man who had found his way home. "I love you, Marbeth Grayley," he said, the words pulled from a place deep inside him, a place untouched by time or regret. She smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "I know," she said. "I've known since you said my name on that porch." He kissed her then, a kiss that wasn't about desperation or survival, but about beginnings. It was a promise of sunrises, of laughter, of a life rebuilt from the ashes, stronger and truer than before. The wind still whispered through the pines, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a song. The scars of the past don't have to define our future. Sometimes, the greatest strength is found not in running, but in turning to face the storm, together. If you are moved by Marbeth and Clay's story of survival and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories that remind us of the power of the human heart. And let us know in the comments, What do you think was the biggest twist in their journey?